All right. I would like to thank the student for that generous introduction. My colleague and my comrade, Professor Christabell, I appreciate it and I'm humbled by that introduction. I have to tell everyone here today that I'm quite nervous to speak to all of you. And a lot of it has to do because before I even visited Kerala, I knew about Kerala's movement. I knew about the self-help and I knew about the amazing cooperative experience um, coming out of South India. I'm very humbled to be a part of your conference. Um, it made me very emotional to see that program in its entirety because there's nowhere in the world, I believe, particularly in the Western world, that could imagine crafting such an amazing conference dedicated to the idea of cooperativism in its various forms. So I thank the University of Kerala for being courageous in its might of bringing the resources necessary. And I heard your Vice Chancellor, Professor Pilal, when he said that indigenous cooperative systems is nothing new to South India or to Keralites. This is something that we have always known, and no colonizer, no external entity had to teach us how to do business cooperatively and with equity. So thank you, the Department of Economics, for inviting me. I appreciated the remarks by your head of department, Madame Nair, Professor Nair, who had important remarks to speak about as an economist. The fact that the Department of Economics is hosting such an event on cooperatives, I was able to participate in the lecture of Professor Gopinath on cooperatives yesterday, and it was phenomenal. The fact that we have economists who are concerned about alternatives and can host such a major event is something that the world should be watching, and I thank all of you. Students, um, engage with my colleague, the executive director of the Miami Institute, in a very dynamic manner. They were able to question the binaries of South and North and made us mindful that even within the South, just as in the North, we have to be mindful of exclusions that are occurring and the elitism embedded in whichever sphere we are living in, whether it's in the South or the North, and that these exclusions against people because of caste, race, regionalism, gender, sexuality and disability, LGBT. This is all things that are happening in our world, irrespective of location, and to be mindful of this. And so, with that, I would like to first acknowledge the land and territory that I sit on. It is the land of Indigenous and Aboriginal people. We are fortunate to live and work on this land. And I want to be reminded that my ancestors who were enslaved in the Americas also contributed to the building up of these American lands. So I want to just give that before I speak. I'm humbled to be here today. The title of my talk is The Black Social Economy, the African Experience in Solidarity Economics. I'm being mindful of time, so I'm trying to keep my eye on the time because Christabel did tell me I have an hour, and so I want to be mindful of that to make sure that I have enough time for conversation. Those of you that are present that want to take a break from being on the screen, please feel free to take your video off. I trust that you will stay with me. As you can see here, it's important for me as a Black feminist to locate where I sit in terms of my positionality. I am a child of immigrant parents who emigrated from the Caribbean to Canada via New York City. We lived precarious for a number of my years growing up, and which made me more aware of the inaccess to opportunities, the problems with accessing basic financial services stayed with me. So it was no surprise that I spent a decade and a half of my life working in international development, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, to some extent in Haiti and other countries in the Caribbean, committed to ideas of financial inclusion. It was my time while I was managing a village bank in Niger that I realized that it was very important for me to think about how I can assist in the kinds of research development and not be a part of a development arena that keeps extracting from the South. And I learned those ideas while I was working in a international nonprofit in the northern part of Philadelphia under the stewardship of an African American by the name of Leon Sullivan. And he was all about co-opting resources, development aid money to emancipate people through cooperativism and self-help. And so now that you know a little bit about me in that way, here is some of my research. My colleague and comrade, Professor Christabell, and I'm very proud to say, with Oxford University Press, will be coming out with a book called Community Economies in the Global South, in which we have about 12 to 15 authors who are working with us, documenting rotating savings and credit associations around the world. And I will be speaking to you today about Roscas, so I'll use the short form, but sometimes I say money pools, and Susu, which is the local term that we use here in Canada among the diaspora, the Black diaspora. I know that you call it something else in Kerala, Kuris or Chit. So Christabell did mention to you, my Canadian students will be very happy to hear that there is a DICE lab located in Kerala. So maybe one day they will want to venture and work with you, Dr. Christabell. We are a part of a network. Dr. Mori is also a part of the DICE collective. There are links to her institute, the Miami Institute. We are trying to decolonize politics and economics in a way that represents feminists exclusively in the DICE collective. And we are unapologetically feminist and anti-racist in that piece of work. So we're making good trouble. More recently, I gave a keynote in a conference in Brazil. So my plan for the future is to figure out how I can learn more from Brazil and from the state of Kerala in terms of how we in the African diaspora can work with Indians from Kerala and the Brazilians to think about building cooperativism as a world model so that we are instructing the world in terms of what it means to do business with humanity. So what am I going to talk to you about today? I'm going to talk to you about one piece of work that is well funded by my provincial and federal state. So I hire a bunch of my students to assist me in doing empirical work. And the piece of work is, I'm embarrassed to say this, that's part of why I'm nervous, it's still in the work. So what you're seeing is live research. I'm still revising my book that is about a year and a half old because the pandemic has had an impact on my life. We are in a stay-at-home order. I have a child at home who's being homeschooled. So my whole life, it's not business as usual. It's actually quite messy. And I'm trying to manage with my family, my elderly parents. So forgive me if it's not in its most perfect form, but I want you to know that I will appreciate all kinds of feedback that you give me. So I'm going to look at the Black banker ladies. This work actually fits and is aligned with something called the UN International Decade for People of African Descent. We're midway through this. And we already know the atrocities and the violence that are being perpetrated against African Americans in the US, and as well as Black Canadians. Dr. Mori gave a pretty good outline in her presentation, her presentation earlier. So I feel comforted in understanding that. But what I'm going to speak to are the contributions and the agency in which people do to mitigate some of those harms. And part of what I'm doing is trying to make the informal seem less suspicious, to give us value on what is informal cooperativism, trying to make sure that we understand the knowledges that are being created by global majority people around the world, regardless of your geographic location, to make sure that they become a voice in the knowledge acquisition that we do to understand how to build that better and how to do business in a more equitable way. And part of that means for me to be in dialogue, to share my research through cultural outlets by local immigrant newspapers who are being validated by the academic research that I do that are hidden behind paywalls. And what I'm doing is taking some of that, presenting it in community forums, and making sure I am writing in their newspapers that they read and pick up at their local grocery stores. They are excited by this work. So what am I going to do today? I am going to introduce this concept of the Black social economy. I am humbled to share this piece of work with you because remember, I'm a student of the Kerala model, so I never feel like I can quite match up to the kinds of work that you are doing. But as Christabell knows, I am on her coattails. So I am going to talk about the empirical work I'm doing. And then I will spend a little bit of time trying to introduce you to some theory, but I won't do it justice. I believe Dr. Mori gave you a pretty detailed outline of some major thinkers who are coming out of the diaspora in the Western world. And I will try my best to pick only 3 findings. And remember, it's kind of in a preliminary state. The book is very much in an unfinished piece. So what I want to start is that in the West, I'm going to hearken to the famous piece by Stuart Hall, The West and the Rest, and many political scientists will understand that piece, in which we look at the international development as this kind of project to fix everything in the West. We apply our stages, linear solutions because we are seen to be in possession of scientific knowledge to assist other countries in their development. I am taking issue with that here sitting in the West, understanding that they have severe limitations and even hypocrisy, if I dare say that, in that within their own boundaries, they are creating spaces of exclusion, intense forms of hostility, even killing of minorities, particularly racialized and Black ones, with impunity. And they are then assuming this role of how to fix countries where these very people originate from. And so I tell you a story about Frank St. Fleur, the person that you see behind on the screen. He is a Haitian Canadian, walks into one of the top commercial banks in Toronto, a very cosmopolitan part of the city, in fact. He's apprehended and detained for hours by the police on the suspicion that he is trying to do something fraudulent. He was a customer of that bank for 10 years. Dana Muhammad, to the right of him, is trying to access her money in the opposite part of the city of Toronto. She is also questioned and harassed for trying to withdraw her funds. These are the everyday indignities that people of African and Black Muslim descent experience in a very cosmopolitan part of the city like Toronto. So I'm exposing that truth. And then Canada provides development assistance to teach other places about inclusion. So it's no surprise that people of color in the Americas, Black people particularly, will be engaging in things called ROSCAs and self-help group and be a part of something called mutual aid. We understand the context of the Americas. I urge you to follow it and learn, because people of African descent in the Americas, many of us have ancestry from people who were enslaved and indentured, and that happened for a very long time. When slavery was abolished, it doesn't mean that the harm finished. There has been a continual system of discriminating and treating people of African descent as less than human. And this systemic racism is what you saw explode on the streets with the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and we keep saying their names because of the pain and suffering people have had enough. In Canada, there's no difference. We have our losses as well. Young Black men, women are being murdered without consideration for their human rights. The UN has accused Canada of failing to disaggregate its data to understand who is being served and who is not being served in terms of very basic necessities. So what is this Black social economy? Where do we move from then? We understand that there is a hostile environment. Well, the social economy is often, the third sector, is the place where people seek refuge. You know it as the third sector. Some call it the solidarity economy. We call it here in Canada the social economy. But the social economy is sometimes complacent. It assumes that there's a relationship, there's an opportunity for partnership or engaging with private sector, commercial banks, what have you, or the government. But when people, Black people, have been humiliated, ridiculed, violated over and over again, that trust is gone. So they start to imagine and innovate within the social economy to protect and save themselves. And that is what I'm terming the Black social economy. It is a space in the social economy that is extremely politicized in terms of the creation of informal cooperative institutions, specifically mutual aid, where people, like-minded people, come together to mobilize resources. And the specific informal institution that I'm here to speak to you about is not unfamiliar to Carolites. You have Curie. You have the informal version of CHIT. I know you have regulated ones, but this is something that is not unfamiliar to you. You can see here that Africa and its diaspora, and I'm going to focus on the African diaspora in the Americas, have various names to call these systems: Susu, Boxhand, Patna, Ekub, Kashiena. It depends on where in the African world the immigrants end up in the Americas that they use these names. But you can see that this is a global phenomenon. People around the world have been doing these ancient systems of collectivity that are very much focused on the collective and very much proud to be about the informal. And so I remind you, when we think about solidarity economies, we think about mutual aid, we think about cooperativism, the title for today's conference. There is this assumption that the third sector, which is that circle dot that my students in Canada will remember this, the circle, the yellow circle is the third sector. And there's this assumption that it interacts with the state or the private sector. But what happens when they don't? So what you see here on the screen before you, and I'm going to put a big star there, is where Roscas reside. So these CHIT funds, these Curry funds, these Susu funds, you can see are very much located in the space of the civil society. They are deliberately not engaging with the state or the private sector. They are focused on those who are most alienated within the business and society. So who am I speaking to? When I share you my findings, the one major important part of the research, and this is live research, right? I'm just finished my research and I'm going through all this data. I'm speaking to Black women. And I often tell students, look at who the researchers are speaking to. Where are they getting their information from? I'm a qualitative researcher. That means that my research often takes years. I've been working on this for the better part of 9, maybe 10 years of collecting this data. It is painstakingly slow because it's qualitative. It requires a lot of travel. You can see that the bulk of the respondents are coming, it's all in the Americas, but the bulk of the Black women I'm speaking to are coming from 5 different countries in the Caribbean. Some of you will be like, oh, that's so cool. Yes, Bob Marley is very cool and political in his lyrics that I know many of you know about. But I'm also speaking to Black people in Canada. And I wanted to complicate my research as a good political scientist interested in cooperativism to make sure that I'm pushing this analysis of South versus North to see what are the learnings we can understand from mutual aid and cooperativism. But I also took trips to Ghana and Ethiopia to recognize and to appreciate these institutions in its original form. My colleague Christabell and I spent time teaching in the Amhara region of Ethiopia. We are familiar with these systems of Ekub that are extremely important there, but they're also important with their diaspora elsewhere. So when you look at that number, 440, you might think that that could be anecdotal, but you have to remember the women who organize these Roskas are called the banker ladies. I did not call them that. This is the name they give themselves. The banker ladies are sort of like the chief bosses who organize these Roskas. These are self-managed cooperative institutions that can range in membership from anywhere from 5 to 6 to 80 to over 100 members. Haiti has some of the largest forms of soul or Roskas, and I'm a part of a Rosca right now, and I think there's about 50 or 60 members. So even if you multiply 440 by, let's say, a conservative number of 20 members on average, you know that these banker ladies are representing that sample that I have, 440, are the direct users who represent thousands of Black women across the Americas. So let me be clear that I'm not interviewing. I did, though. I interviewed hundreds of stakeholders and experts, but they are not going to be the ones I use in analyzing my data in my book. I'm speaking to these Black banker ladies who are the experts who use these systems. Informality, informal cooperative systems, these money pooling Rosca systems, is not something that is detached from the theorizing that's happening in our world. Gibson Graham, this feminist duo, has a wonderful network called Community Economies Research Network. Google them, you should join them. They are speaking about these diverse economies. What they care about is smashing up these binaries of capitalism versus communism, because what they're doing as feminists is moving into all parts of the world and recognizing that most of the world works in the informal. Most of our life exchanges happen below the surface. So what they've come up with their theory is that they've likened it to this iceberg that you see before you. Many of my students know about this iceberg. So what you see visible on the iceberg is the very tiny proportion of the world's elite capitalist firms that are extremely formalized and making lots of money. And we tend to be fixated on that as a concept of success. But when in reality, what Gibson Graham argues and their network called CERN is that most of life's going-ons happen below the surface. And look at self-provisioning, informal finance. That's precisely the kinds of work that we are doing in Kerala, in Brazil, among the African diaspora. We're doing Roscas, we're doing mutual aid. And this is not something that just started or arose out of crisis. It's always been among us. That's the point. The theory of Gibson Graham is useful in that it bashes up these binaries of, capitalism versus socialism / communism to recognize that people around the world have always been doing collectives and cooperatives, irrespective of these ideological concerns. But what they miss is they have a blind spot. They have a blind spot when it comes to thinking about the inequities, when the politics of identities, in the ways that they think about theory. And when I'm speaking to 440 women, Black women from the Americas, it's important that I use theorizing that is originating not just from the region, but also from the diaspora inside of these countries. And so I'm not going to rehash and go through all of this literature, but it's important to know is that there is no shortage of Black political economy that can speak to cooperativism in its various forms for people who must seek refuge because they've been alienated in business and society. Racial capitalism is extremely important. I hope students in Kerala will pick this up, because it is speaking about the inequities that capitalism was an immoral system. It started in 1944 with Eric Williams, a Trinidadian who was like, let us look at the origins of capitalism. It started in the slave trade to benefit and to extract people from their countries in Africa for the benefit of building up Europe. Okay, and there's numbers of, I think Dr. Morey talked about Cox. I'm a big student of Rodney and Marcus Garvey. There is endless literature on Black political economy that I believe students in India should be reading. Read each other. European discourses tend to dominate. Right now, I'm fixated on women scholars who are Black women scholars like Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, Gina Ulisi, Tiffany Willoughby Herrard. They're all writing and questioning the undercurrent of a corrupt charitable design and trying to question those models with ones that are much more sustainable and much more grassroots and localized. I am going to talk about 3 findings. I'm trying to pay attention to time. Let's see how I'm doing. 1 second. Okay. I should be finished in, I guess, about a half an hour, right? So I have 3 findings. They're messy, so bear with me. The first finding that I want you to think about, and this is all the umbrella. Remember, I'm speaking to 440 women in Caribbean countries in Canada who are Black, and definitely the Black concept in Canada is extremely diverse. So I'm happy to answer questions about that. But I want you to think about the first finding, which is this concept of accountability. For so long, the West has convinced the global South that we can't let them do it for themselves, because that's really pushing people towards survival economics and that this concept of bootstrap development. Well, what you'll see here in my film is that the banker ladies will tell you that we have the power. We can mobilize resources within our own community with people we know and trust, and we can ensure that we have sustainable development. Have a listen to this trailer. I think one of my students, I think it's gonna, I don't know if it's gonna show up. Let's see if it shows up. If it doesn't show up, you can watch the film at another time. It's not showing up. So I'm gonna carry on. But there's a great trailer where the 3 of them will talk about the power. It's not showing up on this screen. So, please drop the trailer into the chat box and you can watch it. It's only 20 minutes long. The banker ladies are also questioning this idea of, does banking have to be only fixated on financial transactions? What they're underlining is that the social dimension is extremely important. They're not buying into this idea that we have to digitize everything. This question that I asked before what you see before you makes no sense to the banker ladies that are in the Caribbean, because so many of them have to travel outside of their complex urban environments to get to a proper commercial bank. So it's more convenient for them to use their Patna or their Susu system. But I asked the question to Canadian banker ladies. You can see that 76 of them will use the ATM machines, the machines that you go in and put your card in and you take money out. 76% of them will use it. And you think, whoa, that's impressive in Toronto and Montreal. But actually, the more you probe those questions, you realize that's a reluctance. And the reluctance is that many commercial banks have moved out of low income areas as they have shrunk the numbers of branches they have. So, what has moved in instead are these very high cost, cash for money, predatory financial companies. So, it makes sense for them to use as a sort of a last resort ATM machines. When you ask them the question of online banking, by the way, I did this pre-pandemic. But when you ask them about online banking, 35% of them are participating on online banking. The majority of the banker ladies prefer not to use it. So you think, well, only a third. That's very shocking. People didn't believe me when I initially showed this data pre-pandemic. But because COVID hit Toronto and hit Canada in a significant way, they're all now saying we understand, because what it exposed the pandemic is that there is a major digital divide, that Black and racialized people do not have reliable internet in their homes. And nor are they comfortable with it, these banker ladies. So they rely on their children, the ones that are doing it. And you can imagine, as a mom, we don't want our children knowing our business, right? So you can see the questioning of modernity and the emphasis on the local. Again, this idea of accountability, the trust and the reciprocity is extremely built into these systems. Everywhere I went in Haiti, I heard, "Je connais les caisses populaires avant que je suis né," which is sort of said, the Haitians are telling you that I knew about these systems before I was born. To Caribbeans, that makes complete sense, because this idea that, are you showing me something, Christabell?
Okay. I'm sorry. Nothing is there. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Please continue. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. And so the important part here is that these Haitian women are recognizing that the caisse populaire, these collective systems, have always been a part of their legacy, their grandmothers, their great-grandmothers. People have passed on this tradition. Haiti is known as a cooperative republic. It is something that they know and trust. The second finding that I want to share with you, so we're moving on from accountabilities, the second finding that is pretty prominent across all these cases is this idea of, I'm calling it quiet resistance. It's a kind of a rebellion. It's a kind of a standing up, a political stand towards systems that are hostile and individualistic and commercialized. But I don't know what else to call it. So let's just call it, there's a quiet, subtle resistance that is happening in some spaces across these country cases. Again, I take you to the land of Haiti. They are the first liberated Black republic. They beat the heck out of the French with their tactical design of cooperation and groupement. They call it groupement et combat. You have to imagine the readings. You can read this with the Jacobins and the CLR James, the story of the Haitian Republic. They did what scholar Michel Troureau called the unthinkable. They imagined a place where they could beat the French and the European colonizers out of their country and understand what freedom could be. Haiti has a rich history of these systems of groupement and système pratique. In fact, their entire business, localized business system is run by these women called the Madame Saras. In 1930s, the Americans thought they could come in and occupy Haiti. Well, Haitians just took this as an opportunity to formalize cooperatives. Again, teaching and schooling the West that we can organize both formally and informally cooperativism to save ourselves from you. Robert Faton is a famous Haitian that is working out of the University of Virginia. He studies authoritarianism. On the national stage in Haiti, it is true that elites have corrupted the political process. They are continually denying the Munandeo access to very basic amenities. But Faton says that is not where you're going to find democracy on any national stage in the Haitian context. Where you have to move is into these local arenas where you will see a tremendous amount of democracy building through the systems of combat and groupement. Watch the film Potomitan. It's done by Haitian American Gina Ulysses. She is teaching us how Haitian women use the system of soul to opt out of multinational corporations that come from the US, to build their own local economies in a sustainable way. African Americans keep asking to hear about this Caribbean experience, this experience of the Black diaspora, to assist, to figure out ways of how they too can interrupt corporation and capitalist designs on how to do business. Read this quote, and I'm going to give you a second. Read this quote from Mummy. Mummy is an alias. Caribbean women tend to have another name, and Mummy is a spice seller in St. George, and you can Google all these great places in the small islands in the Caribbean, and look at what she's saying. Susu is the ting, right? You can go to the banker lady and she'll give you what you need, because there's this concept of trust and reciprocity. What Mummy is saying is that we are messing up this system of commercialization because we believe in the collective. She is actually arguing for solidarity systems, cooperative systems. She belongs to Grenada, where more than half of its population, it's a small island, mind you, are really devoted to cooperative, both formal and informal. Again, this quiet resistance of understanding that we don't have to be whole to be a part of some commercial entity. That's powerful. What's happening here is that students this morning questioned, trying to romanticize the South, trying to understand and take apart this idea of binaries of North and South. Well, I'm here to tell you that the exclusions are happening within the South, that in the Guyanese and the Trinidad context, there is an intense form of anti-Black racism. And people think, well, all Caribbeans are Black people. Well, no. There were a lot of indentured servants from India that came once slavery was abolished and settled in the islands. And as, post-colonial politics took over, they ascended into positions of political power. And what you then saw was sort of this divide and conquer model take over. And what you found is Afro-Guyanese, as C.Y. Thomas, a very well-known economist, says, is this color pyramid happening, okay? African Guyanese, Black Trinidadians are at the base of the pyramid, to the detriment of those local elites who play a race politics to control the masses. Afro-Guyanese, hucksters, Trinidadian sellers in the marketplace, one way that they can avoid being humiliated and controlled is to participate in what is known as boxhand and susu. These are Roscas again. These are self-managed, cooperative, collective systems that they use to opt out of corrupt, racist systems and to validate each other's work as business people when the narrative has been one to destroy them. In Jamaica, this is a highly complex country. When we think about it, I worked in the major capital city, that there is a very specific design about garrison communities. I can spend an entire class speaking about that, but there is something called a big man politics that is occurring, where you have gangsters known as dons, these are informal leaders, who also are in cahoots with these corrupt elected, quote unquote, elected officials who try to control the poor and low income and lower middle class through the allocation of formalized finance, such as microfinance. Well, honest people like the woman here, Mrs. Burrell, who doesn't want to be co-opted into those corrupt and big man politics, will participate in what she knows as partner. Partner, again, is a money pool. It is a Rosca. It allows her to buy her food stuff, sell it in Panama or nearby countries or in the big market of Coronation, and it prevents her from being manipulated by the clientelistic politics that are so active. So you see now that form of resistance. Is it quiet? No, it doesn't seem in these context cases. In these cases, it doesn't seem so quiet. But what you see are these issues, these identity issues that complicate life for people and why they so desperately need these informal systems of mutual aid and collectivity. Well, one would question, about, well, is Canada's banker ladies, are they resisting? Do they have politics that complicates their lives to a point where that they are resisting quietly against systems? And I respond to you in the affirmative. That Black Canadian women come from various cultures across the world. They meet in cities of Toronto and Montreal, where my study took place, two of the largest cities with Black communities. And they will astoundingly tell you, as you can see from the qualitative data and the interviews that I did, that they are experiencing intense forms of stigmatization when they practice an ancient system of informal cooperatives like these Rosca systems. They are viewed as terrorists if they're Muslim and they're Black. They are viewed as drug dealers and money launderers if they're Caribbean. And they are generally stigmatized as possibly participating in pyramid schemes and other illicit activities that makes them feel like they must hide these systems. Can you imagine? Canada has a major system of mutual aid, a very respected cooperative system, yet these Roscas are not considered a part of the arena. So these banker ladies hide it for fear of the kinds of atrocities that will happen to them. And in fact, when the police officers raid their low-income apartment buildings, they confiscate their resources and they reject any notion of mutual aid and collectivity. So the banker ladies, when you ask them, do you find that by organizing Roscas that you are resisting mainstream lenders? You can see loud and clear. The 83% are saying yes. What we do every day is resist the concept of commercialized, individualized forms of banking that discriminate against Black people without just reason. And so that's the kinds of acts of resistance that Black women are doing in the Canadian context. This complicates this notion of North and South for all of you, I'm sure. There is this concept of so what I wanted to say here is this idea of respect, and the idea that Black banker ladies, regardless of where they're located, are resisting commercialization of banking by insisting that the collective meets their needs first. Users of these systems, regardless of the kinds of questions they get for participating in the informal, love these systems. They revere them. And in fact, across this data that I'm having actually aligns with a major study that was carried out by these authors to produce the book called Portfolios of the Poor. And what they find with hundreds of financial diaries in Kenya, Bangladesh, India, South Africa, is that these systems of, they call them Stockvel in South Africa, is that these systems of Roscas often top as the number one financial device that lower income and middle class lower people will participate in because of the degree of flexibility that these systems offer them. And I'm not going to romanticize these systems. I hope that someone will ask me about, well, what are the risks of participating in these informal institutions, because there are some downsides, which I'm not going to take up now in the interest of time, but I want you to be aware that they do exist. But I want to underline that Roscas are not, for any of the 440 multiply and their members, the thousands of members, are not the only device that these women are participating in it, but it is one of the most important ones. And when they revere it as a time-honored tradition, what they're basically saying to those in society that ridicule them is that it's okay. We will continue to resist in our quiet ways as we participate in these ancestral systems. So much so that they have provoked commercial lenders in the Caribbean to create product lines that mimic their system. So if you walk into a bank in Jamaica, you're going to find the partner plan. You go into a very elite bank in Haiti, and they're going to have a Mama Soul program in their Soja Bank. Now, the banker ladies know that these aren't exactly their kinds of systems, but they chuckled with the idea that commercial lenders in the Caribbean have now taken up a very ancient tradition that belongs, quote unquote, in the informal sector, and now are offering it as a part of their financial options. This is the divergence between the Caribbean and Canada, because Canada, there is a complete denial that these women are participating in this, and if they do participate in it, they are receiving much hostility. And it's part of that has to do with, look at this book to the right here, The Poor and Their Money, Microfinance from a 21st Century Consumer's Perspective. I think they've confused that. If you remember your Vice Chancellor on day one in his opening plenary, he made it quite clear that these Rosca systems have always been around in the south of India, and it predates any concept of formalized microfinance as we know it, right? The same is true in the Canadian context. Our cooperative systems started off in an informal way before they became formalized. The third finding, how globalized these Roscas have actually become is impressive. For people of the African diaspora, you have to imagine that your ancestors left these scary ports of Ile Gorée off of Senegal, or the Elmina, castle in Cape Coast, Ghana, and they are forced, they're in bondage. They take with them their value systems. They take with them, memories of music, dance, song, food. They take all of that with them as they struggle across and survive on the Atlantic. But what we have to remember, and the Maurice St. Pierre, a historian at HBCU in Baltimore, reminds us through his study of Boxhan in the Guyanese context that people had this idea that they would be free. And he studied the system of buying clubs. People brought their money systems of collectivity to these new lands. So that's very important to see how these Rosca systems traveled, right? There's an ongoing debate since the 1960s that have been going on by the famous Clifford Geertz, an anthropologist who spent years in Indonesia unpacking what he calls arisans, again, a Rosca system. And he said that when modernity takes place in Indonesia, and he's writing in the 60s, that eventually Roscas will become redundant. Well, along comes these feminists, Shirley Ardner and Sandra Berman, and they write this book that you see before you called Money Go Rounds. And what they say is that actually women are not going to let go of these Rosca systems, regardless of how many modern systems we see, no matter how much banks try to attract women and downscale and, appeal to their every need. These systems are more about a social concept. It's about a sense of belonging. It is about camaraderie. It is much more than just a transaction. Watch the Banker Ladies film and you will see how the women are reporting to you that these systems go beyond just a superficial financial aspect, and it has much more to do about sort of repairing the harms in our society. I think the feminists at Oxford win the debate, and because these systems now, we're looking at 2021, and these systems are very much have staying power. As people migrate from around the world, they're using these systems. Earlier today, Dr. Maribel Mori spoke about the future of giving, right? That we should self-finance the revolution. Well, who you see before you is Munira Abukar. She is a Canadian born of Somali parents who ran in a political campaign in the city of Toronto. Her election signs were vandalized. As you can see, it says "Go back home." Well, Munira is actually born and bred in Canada, but she is seen as an outsider. That election that she ran in, I soon found out were actually financed by something called Ayutu money. She did not have the seed capital to run against this big politician. But what she did have was community spirit and connectivity. And what she did was count on the mutual aid of the people in her community, and she mobilized the monies needed to fund her electoral campaign. I believe in the future she will be one of Canada's political leaders. Go Munira Abukar. And I like to show her because she's a big fan of York University, where I'm at. So Fardosa. Fardosa in Toronto is a Somali born, and read what she has to say about globalizing, about the contributions that Black women are making. Okay, I know I'm okay for time. I have about 10 more minutes. So Fardosa is telling us that, people can look at us in bizarre ways and they can question the system of Hagbad. By the way, Hagbad is the name that some Somalis refer to as sort of the Raska system, where they pool resources like your curry system. She says they can look at us and say that is some strange, cultural thing, but we're showing that we can do business for ourselves. We're showing we're doing self-help. What she's actually saying as well is that look at the contributions we're making to Canadian society. My question is, why isn't Canadian society recognizing this? Why isn't our state investing in this kind of financial innovation that Muslim people do because they cannot participate in usurious commercial banks? She also does say, we drink tea and we talk about many things. Again, highlighting the importance of solidarity, camaraderie, and social support. Banks are not doing this kind of collectivity. Many of you who have mothers that participate in your curry systems will be very familiar with that. Anyways, going to a Somali Hagbad meeting is fantastic. They eat fish samosas, they drink spicy tea, they talk politics, they talk about the indignities, and they find solutions, and then they get to business. Part of this globalized concept, Fardosa, is it Fardosa? She's telling us about, we're contributing to Canadian society through our Hagbad system. We are bringing these global technologies here to close the gaps when inequities occur. Well, in Ghana, for centuries, they've been performing and carrying out important systems of collective systems, which they call susu. And much of the Caribbean has inherited those systems and still call these systems susu. In Canada, women are calling it susu. So I figured that it was by time that before I wrap up my Banker Ladies book in the Americas, it was important to go to source countries like Ethiopia, but specifically Ghana, who has been in a major project since the late 80s, 1990s, formalizing a segment of their susu system. So what that building you see there is the National Cooperative Susu Operators Association. They have a regulated association. They have a central bank that is counting and managing and have laws on the books that really create jobs. People pay taxes when they run a Susu bank. The Ghanaians have taken a very pragmatic approach to regulation. Most of the Susu system in Ghana is unregulated and informal, and they understand that, but they wanted to make an option to formalize aspects of it to protect some consumers who might feel that they could be at risk. So below you see this humility susu. It's basically like a shipping container, and she has created it into a sort of like a mobile bank, and she has agents that kind of operate, if you know the village banking motorcycle projects that you see aid agencies doing. Well, she's done it on her own. which is amazing. And so when I went there, and with my colleague, Sammy Bonsu, a professor at the University of Ghana, because I believe doing my research must be in partnership, I am learning, and he is actually leading that work. And what we discovered is that the Susu system is a phenomenal instructor to my banker ladies in Canada. And so what we did was bring the executive director from the National Susu Network. Canada refused his visa like 3 times, but we eventually got him there. And he came to Scarborough, an east part of Toronto, and spoke to York students about the Susu system and the formalization process. So banker ladies were exposed to what it takes to be formalized. There was great debate. I'll tell you about all kinds of complications that arose out of that visit, but at least we're starting to have a discussion about what formality should look like and how globalized these systems are, and that we shouldn't only be thinking about the North providing the development assistance, but how can the South come to places of, like in the North, that have issues with inequities and bring that wisdom? How can Carolites come to Canada and help us with our inequities? Because you're an expert on cooperativism, you're an expert on self-help. We need that expertise in this part of the world. And so let me conclude. I can't tell you how proud I am and humbled to be a part of this conference. I think it is a phenomenal, bold, and courageous one. It is one that has been long overdue. Kerala should be instructing the world on how to do solidarity economics. I was incredibly emotional when I saw that those days of cooperative people speaking, experts about how to do this, and not just formal cooperatives. You have cooperatives and collectives for scheduled tribes. You have them for women. You had the self-help groups. It's just amazing, because what Kerala is teaching the world is that we need to value the informal. And for us, as part of the African diaspora, the informal means a way of seeking refuge. It also means it's a way of repairing the harms and indignities that people of African descent feel in this part of the world. And what these banker ladies, who you see right before you there, they're part of the sisterhood Rosca. They sent me that photo to remind me that Roscas are about keeping equity in place. They're about reaching people that refuse to bank with them. And what is important here is that Roscas, chit funds, Susu systems, money pooling really do underline the importance of solidarity. And they're moving away from what Dean Spade says, charity. Solidarity is not charity. Mutual aid, solidarity systems, as your Vice Chancellor said, is a term that we didn't realize that we were doing, but we've always been doing that, because the idea of mutual aid is embedded in the lives of people from the South, people from the global majority, whether you live where I am or you are where you are, have always been engaging in these systems. And it's high time that the very people who perform development in the name of inclusion and diversity and equity start understanding that they have experts who have always been doing collectivity, and they should draw on those knowledge systems. I am hard at work, and I beg and I ask all of you to join me in this struggle of knowledge production when it comes to cooperativism. I want to build a massive system that we are producing cooperative experiences in its variety forms. And I want to make sure that the Quilombos and the Cachehenas of Brazil, the Kundambashri chit funds of Kerala and the South India become very much the leaders in terms of where we go with this. And I want to join the African diaspora experience with their Susu, Raska, their Hugbud and Ayutu funds, and to push things like the International Cooperative Alliance to create a space for the African diaspora, because it's absent right now. And if we can remember theorizing, not too long ago, before I came to Kerala, I spent some time in Pune, because I wanted to go to the Ambedkar Museum. I really do believe India's chief architect, people must remember, he was an economist by training, understood the inequities that happen to certain groups of people and wanted to raise awareness globally about that. And I do believe that these ideas of cooperativism is sort of the ways that we will move to humanize the economy. I thank you for being so patient listening to me. I'm kind of nervous to do this and to be among Carolites who really have this knowledge and expertise, but I am humbled to be in your presence. I wish students will come and study with me here in Canada. So Professor Varkey and Christabell and Professor Nair, please send your students to study. We will send our students to learn from you. We have to think about not making this a one-off conference, but I do believe the University of Kerala should be actually a summer school or some sort of site for everyone who wants to claim they know the solidarity economy should really be passing through Kerala and the University of Kerala to really kind of get their qualifications in order if they really want to say they understand what solidarity is all about. And with that, come follow me on Twitter and keep in touch and ask me plenty of questions, even though it's like, I think it's past midnight in my part of the world. I thank you, and I'm finished.